Look, when Jay signed his contract, the big one was with Beyonce. Mm-hmm. When he signed that contract, the marriage contract, he got trophies. Now those fucking trophies, trophies came rolling in, buddy. He started getting Grammys left and right, man. I mean, look, listen, if you look at his career,
this guy.
Oh, wow. You're gonna let him say that?
Jay was getting Grammys.
He had one.
Exactly.
He had one.
And he didn't show up.
He had like 20 now.
Hold on.
He had like 18 since he been down. Look, he had one, bro. Hard Knock Life.
Hold on. You're not wrong. At the same time.
He got them shits. He's like drinking. His pictures with him like fucking things the cup.
Wait a minute. So you're saying the success is derived from the marriage?
I've absolutely been treated differently.
The accolades.
Because he's no longer viewed as what, like a street or gangster rapper. Now he's viewed as a businessman, entrepreneur, family man.
And the biggest ones because of the position Beyonce's.
Oh, wow.
Before the rivalry had a name, before it could be measured in sales weeks, radio spins, or headline quotes, there was already pressure in the air. New York in the late 1990s was not simply a city producing hip-hop. It was an arena recalibrating power. The old myths were still standing, but their foundations were cracking. The streets had fed the music for a generation, yet the industry was beginning to feed on the streets in return. Visibility had become currency. Silence had become strategy. Every ascent cast a longer shadow than the one before it. At the center of this shifting landscape stood a figure who had learned to move without noise. Jay-Z emerged not as a disruption, but as a consolidation. He was the architecture of survival refined into elegance. His presence suggested permanence. His voice carried the assurance of someone who believed the throne already existed, waiting only to be occupied. The city watched him not as a challenger, but as gravity. Albums stacked, networks expanded, power settled around him like infrastructure. This was not chaos. This was order learning how to speak in rhyme. Elsewhere in the same city, a different force was forming. It did not move with the same patience. It did not seek legitimacy through gradual accumulation. It came from pressure, from rupture, from collision. Curtis Jackson emerged from South Jamaica, Queens, not as an architect, but as a projectile. Where Jay-Z suggested continuity, 50 Cent embodied interruption. His voice carried threat, humor, and hunger in equal measure. He did not sound like someone waiting to inherit power. He sounded like someone who planned to take it. At first, these forces did not face each other. They did not need to. Their trajectories alone made the tension inevitable. One represented mastery of the system, the other its exposure. One understood power as something to be stabilized, the other as something to be tested. New York could hold both, but not without strain. The city had always thrived on contradiction, yet this felt different. This felt like two definitions of dominance competing for the same center. Hip-hop itself was changing shape. The aftermath of earlier tragedies still haunted the genre, leaving behind an unspoken rule. Direct confrontation had become dangerous. Public rivalry now required indirection, symbolism, deniability. Words mattered, but context mattered more. A line here, a release date there, a feature granted or withheld. The battleground had expanded beyond the booth. It now included boardrooms, distribution deals, brand alliances. Power no longer announced itself. It maneuvered. Jay-Z understood this instinctively. His moves were rarely loud. They were timed, calculated. When he spoke, it was often after the echo had already formed. His confidence did not depend on confrontation. It depended on inevitability. He was the visible center of the city's success story, proof that survival could evolve into sovereignty. For many, he represented arrival. For others, he represented closure. 50 Cent arrived carrying the opposite message. There was no promise of closure in his presence, only escalation. His early work did not ask permission. It named names. It crossed lines that had recently been declared untouchable. Where the genre had learned restraint, he brought provocation. Where caution had become wisdom, he treated it as weakness. His emergence was not just musical. It was psychological. He reminded the city of something it had tried to forget. That fear still worked. The audience felt it before it was articulated. There was an unease beneath the celebration, a sense that the order being built might not survive its own success. Every system creates the conditions for its challenger. Every throne creates the desire to test its weight. The city began to project meaning onto these figures, even before they acknowledged each other. Jay-Z became the symbol of the established center. 50 Cent became the symbol of the returning edge. Media played its role, amplifying signals, framing gestures, transforming moments into narratives. A freestyle became a statement. A release schedule became a challenge. Silence itself became a form of speech. The spotlight did not just illuminate. It distorted. It magnified differences, simplified complexities, and demanded conflict where nuance existed. The rivalry was not yet declared, but the stage was already set. This was not a feud born of insult. It was born of incompatibility. Two visions of power occupying the same city at the same time. One built on accumulation and endurance, the other on disruption and survival. One spoke fluently in the language of institutions, the other in the language of pressure. They did not need to declare war. Their coexistence was enough. The city understood this logic. New York has always measured itself through its icons. Who runs it? Who defines it? Who speaks for it? Every generation asks the same question, even if the answer changes. In this moment, the question sharpened. Was the future of hip-hop a controlled empire, or a perpetual insurgency? Was power something to protect, or something to provoke? The rivalry between 50 Cent and Jay-Z did not begin with hostility. It began with recognition. Each represented a possibility the other could not fully absorb. Each cast a shadow the other could not ignore. The tension lived in the space between them, growing quietly, feeding on ambition, amplified by attention. It did not announce itself as conflict. It announced itself as inevitability. And in a city built on echoes, inevitability is never silent for long. Jay-Z's formation cannot be separated from the logic of endurance. His early years in Brooklyn were shaped by scarcity, but also by observation. He learned not only how to survive, but how to read systems. The streets taught him risk, but also timing. When to move, when to wait, when to disappear. His ascent was not driven by spectacle, but by accumulation. Each step reinforced the last. Each alliance expanded his reach. By the time his voice reached the mainstream, it already carried the weight of someone who had outlasted multiple versions of himself. This orientation toward longevity shaped his aesthetic. His music rarely begged for attention. It assumed it. The tone was measured, confident, often reflective. He positioned himself as a narrator who had already passed through chaos and emerged with insight. This was not raw confession. It was distillation. The persona he presented was not a mask hiding insecurity, but a structure designed to manage it. He spoke from the position of someone who had learned how to control exposure, how to reveal just enough to remain human while preserving authority. Psychologically, this placed Jay-Z in alignment with power as stability. He did not seek domination through volume, but through centrality. To be unavoidable rather than aggressive. His ambition was not to disrupt the system, but to become synonymous with it. Rockefeller Records was not just a label. It was a declaration that ownership mattered more than visibility. that the real battle was not lyrical, but infrastructural. He understood that culture follows capital as much as it follows voice. 50 Cent's foundation followed a different logic entirely. Where Jay-Z learned how to endure, 50 Cent learned how to survive. The distinction matters. Survival does not teach patience. It teaches immediacy. His early life was defined by exposure to violence, unpredictability, and constant threat. There was no assumption of continuity. Every day was provisional. This shaped a psychology oriented toward confrontation, humor as defense, and dominance as protection. His voice did not sound reflective, because reflection was a luxury. It sounded alert. Musically, this translated into directness. His hooks were blunt. His narratives were unapologetic. He did not soften danger into metaphor. He named it. Where Jay-Z spoke as someone who had escaped the fire, 50 Cent spoke as someone still standing inside it. This created an immediate bond with audiences who recognized that energy, not as nostalgia, but as realism. His appeal was not elegance. It was pressure. Their early careers unfolded in parallel without direct collision, but the industry already sensed the tension. Both were products of New York, but they represented different responses to the same environment. Jay-Z transformed street knowledge into corporate fluency. 50 Cent transformed it into spectacle and threat. One emphasized control of narrative. The other emphasized control of fear. Both sought dominance, but through incompatible strategies. The industry context sharpened this contrast. By the late 1990s, hip-hop had become an economic force large enough to require management. Labels were no longer just distributors. They were curators of risk. Artists who could stabilize revenue were favored. Those who introduced volatility were treated with caution. Jay-Z fit neatly into this emerging logic. He was reliable. He understood optics. He knew when to escalate and when to retreat. 50 Cent, by contrast, represented unpredictability. His early buzz did not come from institutional support, but from disruption. His willingness to name names, to break the unspoken rules that had formed after earlier tragedies, made him both magnetic and dangerous. He did not just want entry into the system. He wanted to test its limits. This placed him in a precarious position, admired by audiences, feared by gatekeepers. Psychologically, this set the stage for projection. Jay-Z could be seen as the figure who had successfully translated street credibility into legitimacy. For some, this was aspirational. For others, it suggested compromise. 50 Cent could be seen as the return of unfiltered aggression, proof that the edge had not been fully absorbed. For some, this was authenticity. For others, it was regression. Each became a mirror onto which the culture projected its unresolved tensions. Their early indirect interactions reflected this dynamic. When Jay-Z acknowledged 50 Cent, it carried the tone of someone aware of a rising force, but confident in his own position. When 50 Cent referenced Jay-Z, it carried provocation, humor, and challenge. Not hatred, but testing. As if asking whether the crown was decorative or structural, whether power would respond or hide behind scale. The city itself intensified these readings. New York has always measured legitimacy through proximity to its center. Who owns the narrative? Who defines success? Who gets to speak without consequence? Jay-Z had reached a point where his presence alone shaped the field. 50 Cent entered that field like a foreign object, forcing recalibration. The question was not whether they disliked each other. It was whether the system could contain both without rupture. Media amplified this tension by framing moments as signals. A line on a record, a comment in an interview, a decision not to respond. Silence became interpreted as strategy or avoidance, depending on allegiance. The rivalry began to take form not through open conflict, but through accumulated interpretation. Each side read into the other's moves, constructing meaning beyond intention. At a deeper level, this rivalry reflected a mimetic dynamic. Desire was no longer directed at objects alone, but at position. What each represented became as important as what each produced. Jay-Z embodied institutional power. 50 Cent embodied disruptive visibility. Each desired dominance in the same symbolic territory, even if their methods diverged. The city could crown only one narrative at a time. This was the field of forces in which the rivalry would unfold. Not a personal vendetta, but a structural tension between two models of power. One rooted in consolidation and silence, the other rooted in confrontation and noise, both drawing from the same source, but moving in opposite directions. The collision was not a matter of if, but when. The first visible crack appeared not as hostility, but as play. In a culture trained to read subtext, humor often arrives carrying a blade. When 50 Cent released early records that treated the industry itself as an open vault, naming figures once considered insulated by status, the gesture functioned as both provocation and audition. It was not personal yet. It was territorial, a declaration that no position was beyond reach, no symbol beyond parody. In this atmosphere, Jay-Z became less a target than a reference point. The highest visible structure in the city inevitably attracts pressure. Jay-Z's initial response did not arrive as retaliation. It arrived as calibration. A line delivered on a stage, later immortalized on record, framed the encounter as asymmetrical. Not equals clashing, but scale asserting itself. The message was clear without being loud. Size mattered. Reach mattered. The crown was not something to be snatched through spectacle. It was something maintained through gravity. For Jay-Z, acknowledging the challenge was enough. Engaging it directly risked granting it legitimacy. For 50 Cent, this response functioned as fuel. Recognition, even dismissive, validated his strategy. His psychology thrived on friction. Every deflection became proof that pressure was working. Where Jay-Z treated the moment as a minor disturbance, 50 Cent treated it as initiation. The idea that a single line could place him in the same conversation as the city's dominant figure confirmed his intuition. Visibility did not require permission. It required impact. This difference in interpretation marked the beginning of escalation, though it remained indirect. Jay-Z continued to expand his empire, releasing projects that reinforced his position as the genre's stabilizing force. His music increasingly reflected retrospection, wealth, and control. He spoke less about survival and more about stewardship. This evolution was not retreat. It was consolidation. He was defining the terms under which success would be measured. Meanwhile, 50 Cent's trajectory was violently interrupted. The attempt on his life did not remove him from the narrative. It sharpened it. Survival became myth. The body itself became evidence. When he returned, his presence carried an aura that no marketing campaign could fabricate. He was not just rapping about danger. He had embodied it and returned. This shifted the symbolic balance. He was no longer just disruptive. He was indestructible. The industry responded with caution. Doors closed. Studios distanced themselves. What could not be controlled was treated as contagion. Jay-Z's world moved in the opposite direction. Institutional support deepened. Partnerships expanded. The contrast grew sharper. One figure was being absorbed into the system. The other was being expelled from it. Yet paradoxically, this exile intensified 50 Cent's appeal. Absence created myth. The shadow grew larger than the object. When 50 Cent resurfaced through mixtapes, bypassing traditional channels, he exposed a vulnerability in the industry's structure. Power assumed control over distribution. He proved attention could still be generated from the margins. This was not just a comeback. It was a demonstration, a reminder that the center depended on the periphery more than it liked to admit. Every copy passed hand to hand was a quiet challenge to the established order. Jay-Z observed this shift without overt response. His silence was interpreted in conflicting ways. To supporters, it signaled confidence. To critics, avoidance. This ambiguity was crucial. It allowed the rivalry to expand without direct confrontation. The absence of open conflict invited projection. Fans filled the gap with narrative. Media amplified speculation. The rivalry became larger than any single exchange. Psychologically, both figures were now locked in a mirrored dynamic. Jay-Z represented what 50 Cent was attacking without naming. Institutional power, curated legitimacy, controlled assent. 50 Cent represented what Jay-Z's position risked suppressing. Raw challenge, unpredictability, the return of fear. Each embodied a threat to the other's symbolic order, even if neither articulated it explicitly. This phase established the rules of engagement. Direct lyrical warfare would remain limited. The real contest would unfold through positioning, through timing, through numbers, through who could command attention without appearing to seek it. The battlefield was no longer the microphone alone. It was the calendar, the chart, the endorsement, the silence between statements. By the early 2000s, the tension had matured into structure. It was no longer about insults or bravado. It was about incompatible models of dominance competing within the same cultural space. Jay-Z's power derived from continuity. 50 Cent's from disruption. The city watched both, measuring which force could reshape the genre's future. The escalation was underway, even if no one declared it openly. The rivalry entered its second phase not through confrontation, but through convergence. When 50 Cent finally re-emerged with institutional backing, the system he had once destabilized moved to absorb him. The alliance with powerful figures on the West Coast transformed his insurgent energy into an organized campaign. This shift altered the balance. He was no longer an external threat. He was now a sanctioned force, carrying both street mythology and corporate momentum. For the first time, his ascent intersected directly with Jay-Z's territory, not symbolically but structurally. This convergence intensified the mimetic tension. Both figures now occupied the same plane of visibility. Sales figures became rhetoric. Release weeks became arenas. The question was no longer who was authentic, but who was dominant. Jay-Z had spent years defining success as longevity, influence, and ownership. 50 Cent redefined it as immediacy, saturation, and undeniable presence. His debut did not simply perform well. It overwhelmed the landscape. The charts bent. Radio cycles collapsed under repetition. The city echoed his hooks until they felt inescapable. Jay-Z recognized the shift instantly. His response was not panic, but adjustment. He accelerated releases, mobilized his roster, and reframed competition as inevitability. Publicly, he treated 50 Cent's rise as a natural progression of the genre. Privately, the industry understood the urgency. Dominance in hip-hop had always been precarious, but this moment felt different. The challenger was not waiting his turn. He was forcing a recalibration in real time. Psychologically, this placed Jay-Z in an unfamiliar position. For the first time in years, he was not the uncontested center of attention. The spotlight, once steady, now flickered. This did not diminish his power, but it altered its expression. His confidence became more declarative, his presence more strategic. Statements about numbers, legacy, and scale took on sharper edges. What had once been assumed now needed articulation. For 50 Cent, this phase validated his worldview. Pressure worked. Saturation worked. Fear worked. His approach to power did not require subtlety. It required dominance. Every public comparison reinforced his momentum. Every debate about who ran the city fed his narrative. He understood attention not as a byproduct, but as a weapon. Where Jay-Z managed perception, 50 Cent flooded it. Their interactions during this period were marked by proximity without intimacy. Tours aligned. Brands overlapped. Public appearances framed them as competitors rather than enemies. This ambiguity served both. It preserved deniability while sustaining tension. Each benefited from the other's presence. The rivalry generated energy without requiring destruction. Yet beneath this surface cooperation lay a deeper struggle over symbolic authority. The sales battle between their respective camps crystallized this struggle. Numbers became mythic, not simply measurements, but proof of legitimacy. Each side interpreted victory differently. Jay-Z emphasized first-week dominance, cultural impact, and legacy. 50 Cent emphasized volume, reach, and immediacy. Both were correct within their own frameworks. This was not a disagreement over facts. It was a disagreement over meaning. The media played an essential role in amplifying this divide. Headlines framed moments as turning points. Quotes were isolated and replayed. Silence was scrutinized. Every gesture became part of a larger narrative arc. The rivalry transcended the artists themselves, becoming a lens through which the culture debated its own values. Stability versus disruption. Refinement versus force. Continuity versus conquest. This phase also revealed the limits of each model. Jay-Z's institutional power insulated him, but it also constrained him. Direct confrontation risked destabilizing the very order he had built. 50 Cent's disruptive dominance generated immense attention, but it also burned quickly. Saturation carried the risk of fatigue. The audience began to sense the cost of perpetual escalation, yet neither could retreat. The mimetic dynamic demanded persistence. To step back would be to concede symbolic ground. Each move was now interpreted not only on its own terms, but in relation to the other. The rivalry had become self-sustaining. It no longer required provocation. It existed as an ongoing comparison embedded in the culture's consciousness. By the mid-2000s, the question had shifted. It was no longer about who would win a specific battle. It was about which model of power would endure. Jay-Z's approach promised longevity, adaptability, and institutional relevance. 50 Cent's promised impact, disruption, and immediate dominance. The genre itself stood at this crossroads, pulled between consolidation and rupture. The escalation had reached a point where resolution was neither possible nor desirable. The rivalry functioned as a pressure system, shaping decisions, influencing narratives, and redefining success. It was no longer personal. It was structural, and its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The third movement of the rivalry unfolded through displacement rather than collision. As both figures expanded beyond music, the terrain itself began to shift. The center of power was no longer confined to albums or charts. It moved into boardrooms, partnerships, and symbolic ownership of culture's future. This transition did not dissolve the rivalry. It transformed it. What had once been a contest of presence became a contest of architecture. Jay-Z leaned fully into this evolution. His role increasingly resembled that of a custodian of the genre's institutional memory. He positioned himself not just as an artist, but as a gatekeeper, shaping which voices entered the spotlight and under what conditions. His language reflected this shift. He spoke of stewardship, of legacy, of responsibility. The throne was no longer just his to occupy. It was his to protect. This posture reframed competition as something almost paternal, necessary but controlled. 50 Cent approached expansion differently. His ventures mirrored his musical strategy. Aggressive, opportunistic, public. He treated business not as quiet consolidation, but as another arena for dominance. Every deal became a headline, every success a challenge. His victories were loud, his failures equally visible. This transparency reinforced his image as a figure who thrived in open conflict. Even outside music, he remained performative, turning commerce into spectacle. This divergence deepened the symbolic divide. Jay-Z's power became increasingly abstract. It operated through influence rather than presence, through alignment rather than confrontation. His authority was felt even when he was absent. 50 Cent's power remained visceral. It required demonstration. It demanded acknowledgement. When he moved, the culture noticed immediately. When Jay-Z moved, the effects were often felt later, embedded in structure. Their intermittent collaborations during this period added complexity rather than resolution. Public unity did not erase private tension. Instead, it highlighted the underlying competition. Cooperation became another form of comparison. Who benefited more? Who appeared dominant? Who controlled the narrative? Even moments of alignment were read as strategic rather than sincere. The rivalry had taught the audience to look beyond surface gestures. Psychologically, both figures were now navigating the limits of their original identities. Jay-Z's transformation into an executive risked distancing him from the immediacy that had once grounded his authority. His music reflected this tension, oscillating between reflection and reaffirmation. He needed to remind the audience, and perhaps himself, that he still occupied the center, not just administratively but symbolically. 50 Cent faced a different challenge. His model of dominance depended on opposition. As the culture evolved and new figures emerged, the question became whether his confrontational energy could adapt without losing potency. His public critiques increasingly targeted the structures Jay-Z represented: corporate safety, strategic silence, controlled narratives. These critiques were less about personal grievance and more about worldview. He was challenging the legitimacy of power that no longer needed to prove itself. Media narratives during this phase crystallized the rivalry into archetype. Jay-Z became the embodiment of the empire. Calm, calculated, enduring. 50 Cent became the embodiment of the insurgent turned magnate. Loud, relentless, unapologetic. The audience no longer expected a lyrical showdown. The real drama lay in watching these archetypes test the boundaries of their influence. Moments of renewed tension surfaced through commentary rather than music. Interviews, side remarks, indirect assertions of relevance. Each statement functioned as a symbolic move, reinforcing positions rather than escalating conflict. The rivalry had matured into a long-form negotiation over meaning. What did it mean to run a city? To define a genre? To claim authority in a culture that constantly reinvents itself? At this stage, the rivalry's power lay in its persistence. It no longer needed events to sustain it. It existed as a framework through which achievements were interpreted. A successful venture by one was immediately measured against the other's legacy. Absence itself became meaningful. Silence was no longer neutral. It was read as confidence or avoidance, depending on perspective. This displacement of conflict from direct confrontation to symbolic positioning marked the rivalry's most durable phase. It ensured longevity without destruction. Neither figure needed to fall for the narrative to remain compelling. Their coexistence, tense but stable, mirrored the genre's own evolution. Hip-hop had grown too large for singular dominance, yet it still craved central figures. By moving the rivalry into the realm of structure rather than spectacle, both artists secured their positions. Jay-Z as the architect of continuity, 50 Cent as the force that never allowed that continuity to become complacent. The escalation did not end in victory or defeat. It stabilized into a dynamic equilibrium, one that would continue shaping interpretation long after the moments themselves faded. By the time the rivalry had fully migrated from music into structure, its true function within hip-hop culture became visible. It was no longer a story about two men competing for dominance. It was a living argument about what power in hip-hop was allowed to look like. The tension between Jay-Z and 50 Cent operated as a cultural engine, forcing the genre and its audience to continually renegotiate its values. Every debate about authenticity, success, relevance, and legacy passed through this symbolic filter. The most immediate impact was the normalization of dual legitimacy. Prior to this era, dominance in hip-hop tended to consolidate around a single narrative at a time. A king emerged, held the center, and eventually fell. The rivalry disrupted this rhythm. Jay-Z and 50 Cent demonstrated that power could exist in parallel forms. Institutional authority and disruptive dominance could coexist without one fully erasing the other. This altered how success was imagined. It was no longer singular. It was plural and contested. For audiences, this created a new mode of identification. Fans no longer aligned solely with an artist. They aligned with a worldview. Supporting Jay-Z often meant endorsing patience, strategy, and evolution. Supporting 50 Cent often meant endorsing aggression, transparency, and confrontation. These alignments extended beyond music into broader cultural attitudes toward capitalism, loyalty, and survival. The rivalry functioned as a proxy through which listeners negotiated their own relationship to power. Media played a decisive role in transforming this tension into myth. By constantly framing moments as symbolic victories or defeats, it elevated routine industry moves into cultural events. A chart position became a referendum. A business deal became a declaration. Even silence became content. This amplification did not distort the rivalry. It completed it. The rivalry required mediation to achieve scale. Without the echo chamber of media, it would have remained a series of private calculations. With it, the rivalry became collective experience. This process intensified tribalism within the culture. Allegiance hardened. Interpretations diverged. The same event could be read as confidence or cowardice, depending on perspective. This polarization mirrored broader social dynamics emerging at the same time. The early 2000s marked a shift toward identity-based affiliation across media landscapes. Hip-hop, always sensitive to shifts in collective psychology, reflected this pattern with unusual clarity. The rivalry became a site where group identity was rehearsed and reinforced. At a deeper level, the rivalry exposed unresolved anxieties within hip-hop about legitimacy and assimilation. Jay-Z's ascent into corporate spaces raised questions about whether success required compromise. His defenders argued that ownership was the ultimate form of resistance. His critics feared that integration dulled critique. 50 Cent's confrontational posture revived anxieties about violence, volatility, and spectacle. His defenders saw honesty. His critics saw regression. The rivalry allowed these anxieties to surface without requiring resolution. Symbolically, the two figures came to represent opposing relationships to visibility. Jay-Z mastered the art of controlled exposure. He appeared selectively, spoke deliberately, and allowed absence to reinforce authority. 50 Cent weaponized overexposure. He flooded the field, saturating attention until resistance became futile. Both strategies proved effective. Both reshaped how artists approached the public eye. The genre learned that visibility itself was malleable. It could be rationed or overwhelmed. The rivalry also altered the genre's relationship to conflict. Open lyrical warfare became less central. Strategic positioning replaced direct insult. This did not diminish intensity. It redistributed it. Conflict migrated into release schedules, partnerships, and public narratives. Hip-hop learned to fight without appearing to fight. This evolution mirrored changes in global power structures, where influence increasingly operated through systems rather than force. The rivalry served as a tutorial in this new logic. For younger artists, the impact was profound. They inherited a landscape where success no longer followed a single script. One could build slowly and endure, or arrive explosively and dominate. Both paths were valid. Both carried costs. The rivalry expanded the imaginative space of hip-hop, even as it intensified pressure. New entrants were measured against both archetypes simultaneously, expected to balance immediacy with longevity. The audience, in turn, became more sophisticated interpreters of power. Listeners learned to read subtext, to understand that absence could be louder than presence, that collaboration could mask competition. The rivalry trained its public to think structurally rather than episodically. Hip-hop consumption became less about individual songs and more about trajectories. Who was rising? Who was consolidating? Who was being eclipsed? Culturally, the rivalry stabilized into a reference point. It became shorthand for broader debates about ambition and ethics, about whether power should be centralized or challenged, about whether survival narratives should evolve or remain confrontational. These questions extended beyond hip-hop into conversations about race, capitalism, and representation. The rivalry did not answer them. It kept them alive. By transcending personal animosity, the rivalry achieved durability. It could be reactivated whenever similar tensions emerged. New conflicts were read through its lens. New figures were compared to its archetypes. In this way, the rivalry ceased to belong exclusively to Jay-Z and 50 Cent. It became part of hip-hop's symbolic infrastructure, a permanent fault line running through the culture's understanding of itself. This was its greatest impact. Not dominance, not victory, but transformation. The rivalry reshaped how power was imagined, contested, and narrated within hip-hop. It left behind not a resolution, but a framework, one that continues to shape interpretation long after the original moments have faded from immediate memory. The rivalry did not conclude. It sedimented. Over time, its sharp edges softened into structure, but its outline remained intact. What persisted was not animosity, but orientation. Jay-Z and 50 Cent became reference points through which later movements were measured. Their dynamic outlived specific moments because it never relied on resolution. It relied on contrast. As the culture shifted, the rivalry adjusted with it, absorbing new contexts without losing its core tension. Jay-Z's legacy consolidated into permanence. His authority no longer depended on constant output or confrontation. It resided in infrastructure, in the quiet ability to shape environments where others operated. His presence became architectural. Even when absent, his influence organized space. He stood as proof that survival narratives could evolve into stewardship without erasing origin. The crown he wore was no longer symbolic of conquest, but of continuity. Power expressed as gravity rather than force. 50 Cent's legacy followed a different arc. His impact was never about quiet endurance. It was about rupture that left marks. Even as his visibility fluctuated, the memory of his dominance lingered. He remained the reminder that systems could be overwhelmed, that attention could be seized rather than granted. His posture toward power never fully softened. Even in commentary, his voice carried challenge. He functioned as a perpetual stress test for legitimacy, asking whether authority could withstand exposure. The absence of a definitive ending preserved the rivalry's relevance. There was no reconciliation to neutralize it, no final battle to exhaust it. Instead, it settled into myth, a story retold whenever questions of dominance resurfaced, whenever an artist chose between patience and provocation, whenever the genre debated whether evolution meant refinement or dilution. The rivalry offered no answers, only orientation. In retrospect, the rivalry reads less like a feud and more like a dialogue conducted through parallel monologues. Jay-Z spoke in structure, timing, and silence. 50 Cent spoke in saturation, humor, and confrontation. Neither needed the other's approval, yet each required the other's presence to sharpen meaning. Their coexistence produced clarity through tension, not harmony. This dynamic mirrors a deeper truth about cultural power. Dominance is never absolute. It is negotiated continuously, shaped by resistance as much as control. Jay-Z represented the possibility of mastering systems from within. 50 Cent represented the inevitability of challenge from without. Together, they mapped the limits of each approach. Neither model fully absorbed the other. That incompleteness is what gave the rivalry longevity. As hip-hop moved further into the global mainstream, the questions raised by their rivalry became more pronounced. Who owns culture when it becomes infrastructure? Who speaks for authenticity when survival becomes brand? How does power maintain legitimacy without losing edge? These questions did not belong to one era. They traveled forward, attaching themselves to new figures, new conflicts, new stages. The rivalry's afterlife lives in comparison. New artists are still described using its language. The quiet builder, the disruptive force, the empire, the insurgent. These archetypes persist because they articulate a tension that cannot be resolved. Culture requires both. Stability without challenge stagnates. Challenge without structure burns out. Hip-hop learned this through their parallel ascent. What remains most striking is the absence of collapse. Neither figure was destroyed by the other. Neither conceded ground in a way that erased identity. This endurance reframed rivalry itself. Conflict no longer required annihilation to be meaningful. It could function as sustained pressure, shaping evolution over time. The genre matured through this realization. In the end, the rivalry did not tell a story of victory. It told a story of coexistence under tension, of power negotiated rather than seized outright, of identity formed in relation to an opposing force that never fully disappears. Jay-Z and 50 Cent did not end each other's reigns. They defined the boundaries within which reigns could exist. That is why the rivalry remains active in memory, not as unresolved drama, but as structural clarity. It continues to operate as a map, a reminder that culture advances not through singular dominance, but through friction held in balance.